Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Polland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight we welcome two important guests to talk about the new energy crisis of 2011. First, Bruce Vincent, President and Director of Swift Energy Company, a Houston independent oil company. And Bruce is also chairman of a critical organization nationally, Independent Petroleum Association of America. In addition, we have Ryan Kennedy, who is an assistant professor of energy politics here at the University of Houston in the political science department. And David, these are two great guests.
The only one who's in the business who can tell us anything about the business of energy is Mr. Vincent. So, I mean, Mr. Kennedy is probably one of these environmentalists that we won't pay any attention to, I guess.
Maybe not, David.
So, Bruce, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and what the IPAA is all about?
Well, the IPAA is the trade organization that represents America's oil and gas producers. Independent oil and gas companies actually drill 95% of the wells in this country. They produce 85% of the natural gas and about 54% of the oil and liquids in this country. They're the ones that make it happen. Independents actually, if you look at their whole ecosystem, actually contribute about 4 million jobs to this country. It's about 3% of the nation's workforce. If you look at 2010, that ecosystem contributed about 4% of the GDP to this country. So it's a significant part of this country, and it's the small businessmen. There are about 18,000 independents. Average company probably has about 12 employees. They're the ones that make it happen in America.
And we're 1 year out or away from the BP explosion and disaster, and even though the medium-sized companies that you're talking about, maybe only small players out there, maybe you can address. We have had some permitting in the Gulf of Mexico. Deep water drilling is going on, yet there has been no change in the design of the blowout preventer. The liability cap is the same as when it was at the Exxon Valdez days. What has changed to protect the Gulf of Mexico, or is it just BP and the big companies running the show still?
Well, there are a lot of people involved in the Gulf of Mexico. There are a lot of independents involved in the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, if you look just at the jobs for 2009, about 200,000 of the jobs in the Gulf of Mexico were just independents. In terms of a couple of those questions you talked about, the blowout preventers have been an effective tool in this industry for decades. Clearly Macondo was an accident, but it wasn't a systemic problem.
I thought there was a third-party neutral examination that said there was a design flaw in the blowout preventer,
well,
and yet it's still the same.
I'm not privy to that analysis. I know they did talk about the blowout preventer failing because the pipe was offset in it. But you also talked about the liability cap. One of the things that people don't understand is that there is no cap on liability in the Gulf of Mexico if people do something wrong. That liability cap is strictly related to the definition of strict liability, which is a no-fault liability cap. And that's when the constructors of OpenINI and the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, when it was developed back following the Exxon Valdez, actually knew what they were doing in terms of the development of that cap. What they wanted to do was provide a mechanism, particularly for small businesses, the fishing companies, the restaurants, the local hotels, when affected by a spill, that they could get reimbursed for their claims fairly quickly. They didn't have the ability to sue and go through a multi-year process to litigate. And that's why the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund was created. That cap was a cap on using the strict liability definition, which, as I said, is no-fault liability. If companies do something wrong, there is no cap on liability, and so there really is no need to change that particular part of that definition.
Well, Mr. Kennedy, you may have heard something that is magic to the ears of all Americans in Bruce's presentation. That is jobs. Now, has the argument of job creation overwhelmed science and overwhelmed, sort of the deterrence which lifting liability caps would have had on the types of accidents that were represented by BPs?
Well, certainly I think that's one of the strongest arguments that the industry has for resuming drilling or for lifting moratoria, is that it increases jobs, it may help to decrease some of our trade deficit. What I'd like to do is focus, though, on the larger scale. We're talking about the new energy crisis. And if we're looking at prices at the pump, if we're looking at our meeting over the medium to long term U.S. energy needs, lifting the moratoria or expanding domestic drilling is not going to be able to contribute a lot to solving those problems.
Okay, well, let's talk. We talked about the impact of what happened in the Gulf oil spill, and I think the political reaction to that, Professor. So I want to kind of get your take on that, because it seems to me that the politics that got involved with with the blowout actually made things a lot worse.
Well, it really depends on how you're thinking about the politics of things. I mean, certainly, if you look at what we found out about how that particular well was run, about the problems that occurred there, I think you would agree with me on this, that there were a number of issues that really needed to be addressed. And the public's reaction to that, I think, and the political reaction to that is, completely understandable.
Okay, but did you think it made sense for Obama to shut down every other drilling operation in the Gulf, even though there was no indication that there were problems with those drillings? In fact, I think that there have been none, to cost 20,000 jobs, and then to basically shut down offshore drilling all over the country. Atlantic, Pacific, that's gone, even though he said he was going to do it, nothing in Alaska. I mean, we're not going to drill anywhere under Obama, yet he says he wants to expand domestic energy production. What are we going to use?
Well,
cow flatulence?
Well, a few things that you mentioned there. The first thing I want to deal with is this idea of expanding domestic production. I mean, according to some of the reports that I've looked at, if we were to lift all of the moratoria currently in place, we would increase the amount of production to the extent that where in 15 years we could meet maybe about 5% of current domestic demand. Now, if we look at the expansion of domestic demand during that same time period, we could lift all of the moratoria that we have on drilling, and we would still be importing more oil by 2025 than we are today. In terms of the specifics of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico or drilling in the Atlantic, these are issues which, there was a very smart man who I saw on the news actually at one point who said that after the disaster took place, there was certainly a need to have a time period, a time period where you're able to breathe, a time period where you're able to investigate. And it seems that the Obama administration has decided that they have not completed those investigations and that they have not been fully reassured that these systems are in place in order to protect the Gulf of Mexico and these other environments.
You must be satisfied, Mr. Vincent, that there is a debate going on in Washington now about subsidies for the oil industry. Some of them tax breaks that go back to 1913, one 1950, which if repealed would give us another $8 billion over the next 10 years. It's $4 billion a year, and this to people like Exxon are making $10 billion a quarter. Are you comfortable about these debates?
Well, you hit on a very critical issue. People in Washington use the word subsidy, but there aren't subsidies. The oil and gas industry does get expenses, income tax deductions for normal and ordinary business expenses, so that you pay taxes on net income, not on gross income, like most other businesses in America do. These tax deductions that they talk about, one of them they talk about percentage depletion. The majors don't get it already. Many independents don't get it because it's only on the first 1,000 barrels. So it's really only available for small businesses. It's primarily designed to support the marginal oil producer. We have about 2 million barrels a day of marginal production in this country that is critical. And if that became unprofitable, it would be shut in and perhaps lost for a long, long time, if not forever. And then we'd just be importing 2 more million barrels a day.
Since we know we're having to look for other sources of energy, isn't the president or and others who are after the repeal of these subsidies and are offering to have that reinvested in renewables? Don't they have a point that fossil fuels is going to run out? Peak oil may be here.
Well, you need to look at the facts. I mean, we need to look at what most of the energy comes from in this country. I mean, if we look at where our supply comes from today, it's about 64% of supply comes from oil and natural gas. If you include fossil fuels, it's about 85%. If you look at where we're going to get our energy 25 years from now, it's very similar percentages, a little bit less, but very similar percentages. Now, we believe that we as a country need to have a strategy, an energy strategy that encompasses all the above. We do need to focus on renewables, but renewables are a very, very small part of what there is today. If you look at renewables today, the energy supply, and this includes hydro, which is the vast majority of it, it's about 8%. It's a little bit of biofuels, a lot of hydro, and a little bit of solar and wind. If you look at it 25 years from now, it grows to 13%. That's not the place that we want to focus our attention. We need to focus our attention on where we get the majority of our supply from.
All right, talking about that, Professor, where we get the supply, Is the energy crisis we face this year with gas prices going up since Obama was elected from under $2 to now at many states over $4, is this a product of supply and demand equations worldwide and not necessarily what's happening here?
It's a product of a number of different things. Part of it is supply and demand. Part of it is that what you have is increasing demand from China, you have increasing demand from India, and all of this is straining the current supply. Part of this deals, though, with things like instability in the Middle East. According to one report, about 1 in 5 of the barrels of oil that we import come from a state that the State Department classifies as being unstable or unsafe. So what we've seen is some of this run-up due to events in Libya, fears that you may have instability in Saudi Arabia. So there are a number of factors which are contributing to this. But I also want to play off of what you've said, and that there's a second part to the supply and demand equation. I think too often we talk about, well, we have to increase supply. We can increase supply. We can increase supply. But even the optimistic estimates, I'll use the Heritage Foundation's estimates of ANWR, for example. ANWR, as a portion of proved reserves, is 0.7% of proved reserves. So you can't just ramp up on the supply end. There's simply not enough there if demand keeps on growing the way that it has. So we have to be able to address things on the demand end as well. And maybe that's where I sound like an environmentalist or something, but we do have to try to address some of the demand aspects.
So Bruce, if we deal with demand, and I guess the concept there would be find a way to be more energy efficient.
Well, there are two things on the demand side. That when we talk about all the above, it is not just the supply side. I agree with Ryan. It's the demand side too, and there are two things. It's energy efficiency, and we're doing a lot of things like that now, whether it's having cars that get more miles per gallon or having air conditioners that are more energy efficient. But the other is conservation, and that's the biggest challenge. The only thing that's really driven conservation in the past is high prices. We need to get Americans voluntarily to start conserving their energy, because it is a long-term problem. If you run out the supply and demand models, the price of energy, wherever it comes from, is only going to get higher. And
so people should buy your stock, right? Because you have lots of reserves.
Well, they should buy it for a lot of reasons.
Well, I would add a third aspect to that, and that's research. That whether you're talking about the research which is done into superconductivity to make our power lines more efficient. I think, what is it, 15-30% of the electricity that we distribute, it literally goes up into thin air in the transportation process. It's about trying to make some of the forms of energy, which right now may seem expensive and not able to be distributed widely, to try to make them cheaper and distributed. And this takes a large amount of effort on the part of private industry and government. And I'd point to, as an example of this, a proposal which was brought out by the Brookings Institution and the more conservative American Enterprise Institute, which said that they came up with a plan together to put $28 billion in a revenue-neutral way towards greater research into energy and greater research into new methods of producing energy. So I think that's a third part of that.
Clearly, we have no plan. However, there was a plan. There was a plan offered by the Republicans in the House of Representatives. It passed overwhelmingly with their votes. It was called the Dirty Air Act, which would have limited the EPA from regulating carbon. Basically, next on their agenda is repealing the findings of Galileo, I would imagine. But isn't our problem that we have leadership in the House of Representatives that are completely controlled by science deniers and those who have received the bounty of contributions from industry.
As opposed to the free riders.
I think they're rooted in science, which is why they're trying to restrict the EPA's tactic of trying to implement their version of carbon tax or whatever through the regulatory effort and bypassing Congress in the first place.
But you're not telling me that you don't think you agree that the Earth is warming to our detriment, do you not?
No, I don't.
You don't agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, so that's where
that's
where the
an honest
majority
debate.
That's where the majority is in the House of Representatives as well, and yet the overwhelming scientific understandings is that it is a degree warmer. Tell us whether or not you're on what side of the science are you on?
I've got to say,
I'm on the science side of the science.
Well, this is something very interesting. I mean, this is a debate that I've been following since high school, and ever since high school, you've had this back and forth of, well, we've got these temperature conditions which say are rising, but the satellites don't say it. Well, then we found out later on the satellites say it. Then we hear that it's something, it's natural warming out in the Arctic that's causing it. And then, suddenly we have more breaking off, and that's no longer the case. You really have to look at this for the average person of, does it pass the 5 senses test? Can you touch it, taste it, see it, smell it, hear it? And the answer on all of these is yes, you can. You can go and you can look at the ice sheets in the Arctic, and you can see when the high carbon time periods are and when the warmest time periods are in the Earth. You can look at the amount of carbon that has been put in the air by human causes, and you can see that, no, natural causes do not account for the increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere.
Because there are too many people.
This has been 40 years of scientific effort. And for those people who say, well, it's a scientific conspiracy or something like that, I can tell you as someone on the inside of this, there is every incentive in the world to try to disprove the results of previous science.
So
and the fact that this hasn't been the case.
So does that mean we'll do what David wants and basically quit using carbon, him and his friends at the EPA? Leave your cars at home. You can start walking, riding your bike, and no more air conditioning in Houston in the summer because we can't power it. I mean, those are the things you're talking about.
Oh, no.
Ultimately,
he has actually not said a thing.
Believing in global warming. Well, believing in global warming does not mean any of the draconian measures that you're talking about. If you look at the international discussion on climate change and you look at the proposals which are in there, they talk about making some cuts to carbon emissions, but nobody's talking about eliminating carbon emissions. Nobody's disputing that oil is going to be a part of our long-term future with energy. We simply need too much energy to maintain our standards of living. But to say that this is an either-or, that believing in the climate science means that suddenly, I want everybody to take the bus. That's not.
I do think it's fair to say it's hotly contested, whether it's accurate or not. It is. There is not. David tries to speak for all scientists in the world, but the fact is, there's plenty of good, competent science just on both sides of the issue that don't agree.
Exxon has paid for a bunch of them.
And the fact of the matter is not clear, which is why you don't have an ultimate solution. So the debate needs to continue, but the debate needs to be open and honest instead of closed and one-sided.
You're absolutely
the debate
right.
needs to continue, but let's think about, we do a lot of things scientifically which are not 100% certain, but we do them because they seem to work. We used Isaac Newton's laws of physics for hundreds of years, and it turns out they were a little bit off, and there's now all the discussion of quantum physics. But still, if it accurately describes what's going on in the world and shows itself to be predictive of what's going on in the future, which climate science has, we've seen most of the effects which people in the 1980s and 1970s said would end up happening because of global warming. We're seeing most of those things happening in the 1990s and in the 2000s.
But you're in retreat, your argument, I believe. We had opposition to cap and trade, as you know. There was the defeat of the Kyoto protocols. The Senate couldn't pass cap and trade. Then the Republicans ran against it in 2010 and, got elected on it in some ways.
That's because people want energy, David.
But cap and trade is, and this is something that I'm kind of surprised about to a certain extent. Cap and trade is much better than what we're talking about when we're talking about the other options. The other options for controlling carbon emissions are things like taxing emissions, are things like adding new regulations or new standards. Cap and trade is a system whereby you're able to say, okay, what is it that we deem as an acceptable amount of pollution? And then based on that, you're able to establish a market. It goes all the way back to economics theory in the 1970s of how do you prevent, let's say you have a company that pollutes a lot, that affects another person. If the cost of that pollution is zero, then what do you do? And what's the options for that business? The option is, well, you just keep on polluting. The marginal cost is zero. You have to find a way to, you either regulate it or you find a market for it. And cap and trade is a market solution for this.
Yeah, but yet here's what's coming your way, Mr. Vincent, though. Since cap and trade is dead, the environmentalist crowd and the people who are sensitive to the science arguments and are worried and scared, of whether or not they will have a planet to live on in 60 years or so, or ready to go with another plan of action, a grassroots mobilization, if you will, and some of them are trying to tie it into climatologist, NASA scientist James Hansen's fee and dividend plan, which would be targeting oil as if it were tobacco or cancer, as the bad guys in a campaign. And they would tax oil David? At the wellhead, and then divide up the effective taxing abilities or whatever is brought in as a result of that, and redistribute it to the public.
They're going to let you drill, take all the risk, and then take away all your money, Bruce. You're going to do that?
Any sense whatsoever, and it would never come about because it would destroy this economy. I mean, what you got to understand is energy is what helps give us an American way of life. Every other country in the world wants what the U.S. has.
But we have to raise the price of energy in order to.
Why do we have to raise the price of energy? The market will raise the price of energy, and the more we regulate it or tax it, you're just going to raise the price or the cost of energy even higher. And you're going to make it unaffordable, particularly to the lower income people in this country.
There would be a dividend. It would be rebated to the
after the government takes its share of the money.
Is just redistribution of wealth. That's just another way to do it. It's like the president's latest proposal to start taxing automobiles based on the number of miles that they drove.
Yeah, I'm only saying that the environmental
crowd,
avenue
down to the same path.
The national, natural resource defense people, environmental defense fund, they're very upset with the President of the United States, who almost, in the last budget deal, took the regulation of carbon, and made that was going to include that in the deal. Until the environmentalists found out about it and killed it.
Okay, well, because he's lost interest, or maybe actually he's grown in office, kind of like taking out Osama bin Laden, David. He's making progress. Let's talk about increasing supply or reducing the amount we use. One of the ideas I read about in research for this show was carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is what's going to be used to make the new Boeing 787.
Right.
Reduces weight by 80 or 90% above steel. So these engineers said what we ought to be doing is building carbon fiber automobiles and trucks, and we could explode our gas mileage. The average car would be getting 60, 70 miles per gallon. That would be a way to reduce our dependence on foreign oil.
That's an efficiency issue. Absolutely something we should be looking at. One of the vulnerabilities our country has is in transportation fuels. 99% of our transportation in this country is fueled by liquid petroleum.
What about natural gas? Is that an option?
You can do
vehicles?
it. Well, you can do it on a limited scale. Well, you can use it. You can do it. It's difficult to implement broadly because we have so many individual automobiles. But you can do it for city trucks, buses, things like that, which have a pre-designed route and which refill at a centralized station. So that's certainly one of the things which actually has bipartisan support.
Yeah,
natural gas has support.
And you can ultimately work it into the retail system, but you've got to kind of take it step by step. In the 90s there was a big effort for that, and a lot of that was done to city fleets. Buses and garbage trucks and things that would go out like in a hub and spoke and come back in and mother at night, and they could fill up. The big plan now is to try to move that to interstate long-haul transportation, the trucking fleet. So you also build the infrastructure along the highways. We actually bought a natural gas fueled vehicle back in the 90s, and there were 5 stations in the city of Houston where you get it filled up.
It makes it
that's a problem.
Bruce,
so you've got to build that infrastructure.
Tell us about the dangers of fracturing, which is the process where we go into.
There aren't dangers of fracturing.
There are none?
Hydraulic fracturing is a system used by the industry for about 62 years to complete wells in tight formations. And while much is said and mischaracterized about hydraulic fracturing, many people make accusations about it contaminating freshwater resources, for instance. In 62 years of using this technology, there's not a single case where it's been proven that it contaminated freshwater resources. It is regulated. It is regulated by the states. It's clearly well regulated because it's been successful.
Should it be regulated by the feds rather than
absolutely
the states?
Not. Let me ask you a question. You get a driver's license in Texas to drive in Texas, and you can take that to New York or North Carolina or wherever, and through reciprocity agreements you can drive there without getting a North Carolina or New York driver's license. There are people still speed, there are still accidents on the road. Do we need to implement a federal level of regulation to require a federal driver's license. Would that improve road safety?
No.
No.
Nope.
Same thing here. Why do we need an additional federal level of regulation when the state system works very effectively?
I would say we eliminate the state and have a federal only.
But the situations in the state are different. The geology in Pennsylvania is different from the geology in Texas, which is different from Arkansas, different from Colorado. And the states are the ones that know that better. The freshwater resources that you're trying to protect, it's a lot more important to Pennsylvania, their freshwater resources, than it might be to someone from California. And so the states know that better. They've done an effective job of doing that. There's no reason to add additional regulation just for the sake of adding regulation.
Well,
it needs to be a purpose to it. And you need to look at a risk reward and what do you gain from that regulation.
All right, final question, guys, because we're down to the last 30 seconds.
Okay.
Is there any hope for our viewers who care most about how much they pay at the pump? Are gas prices going down in the next year or going up, staying the same?
Ooh,
Professor Kennedy, you got...
Prognostication is always a dangerous game, but in the short term, I don't think you're likely to see any relief. It's in the medium to long term.
Well, there was a big drop in the oil markets today. I think there's probably $20 in there for the turmoil in the Middle East. Some of that calms down. You'll see pull back in the price. I think the market's fairly
I didn't hear any hope there.
Optimistic. Yeah.
Thanks, guys, for being here. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Vinson, appreciate your time today.
Glad to be here.
We invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar at Red, White, and Blue. Read about our guests, watch the shows, along with our follow-up discussion. And until next time, get informed and get active.